22-page.
Recording in progress.
Just like that. So welcome. Today we're talking to Michael Meltsner, author of the Mosaic, Who Paid for the Book. Michael is the Matthews University Professor of Law at Northeastern. He's an author, a novelist, a playwright. He was hired by Thurgood Marshall as the first assistant counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in the 1960s, where he handled major cases before the federal courts. Among his clients were the North Carolina doctors and dentists who ended Southern hospital racial segregation, which is something we'll talk about with this book, the great Muhammad Ali, and numerous death row inmates challenging capital punishment. He's also a Mass Humanities board member and someone who I really enjoy talking on Zoom and in person whenever I can. Michael, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
So I want to start with your motivation for this particular novel. And Mosaic is called a novel of the civil rights and is all great historic fiction. It's very much a document of its time. Can you talk a little bit about, given the wide variety of media that you're able to write in, why you chose this to be a novel this time?
Well, the backstory is really important. As they say in the movies, this film is inspired by a real story. Well, this novel is really inspired by a real story. And just to jump ahead, I'll fully answer your question in a second, but just to jump ahead, the real story that started all this involved a charismatic doctor named Jean Cousert, who was found dead on her porch in 1967. And it was assumed that by some that it was because she was informing on racial practices in her community. The local community immediately called it an accident, and there was a lot of gossip of the racial variety. Oh, maybe she had a black lover, maybe she committed suicide, maybe she was gay, although they didn't use that word then. And just in the last 2 weeks, the Department of Justice has opened an investigation into determining whether she was really murdered. And that's the core of the background here. Now, why a novel and my role? We have to go back to when I was a lad. I was hired by Thurgood Marshall in 1961. And after he became a judge, my boss, a man named Jack Greenberg, a very brilliant lawyer, even when I was very green, I was there less than 2 years, he said to me, there's a federal law that authorizes segregation in hospitals and medical facilities. I want you to do something about that. It was called the Hill-Burton Act. It was passed by the Congress in 1946. And for the first time, there was national funding in significant fashion and regulation of American hospitals. And it raised the quality of medical care everywhere. And ironically, the main sponsor was an Alabama senator named Lister Hill. He was really a covert progressive, a New Dealer. But to get elected in Alabama, he had to be a segregationist. And so he put in this legislation a separate but equal clause. Hospitals and medical facilities could exclude Negroes, as they were labeled at the time, or segregate. And he had to do this to get elected in Alabama. And he never pretended he was anything but a segregationist. Well, this was a unique thing. There were no other real federal laws that authorized segregation. It was usually a state matter and a state custom, the former states of the Confederacy, and de facto segregation elsewhere. Well, I was assigned to be the lead lawyer at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund to challenge this practice and ultimately bring a number of healthcare cases. And we were very fortunate. We had really a powerful case and powerful plaintiffs in Greensboro, North Carolina, and a great federal judge named Simon Soboleff decided that even though these hospitals were not governmental entities, they took federal money and they were required to follow important regulations. And so they were covered by the Constitution. If they were purely private, they wouldn't have been. And the Supreme Court did not disturb this decision. It became the text of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So what was the situation? The situation was that there were hundreds of hospitals across the country, mostly in the South, that either excluded Black doctors and dentists and patients or segregated them. And there was no way that could change if the federal government didn't do something about it. And in the beginning, the government just required paper compliance. And so just like school boards, these hospitals would file pieces of paper that said, oh, we don't discriminate. We at the Legal Defense Fund brought actual complaints to the government, and there led a very unique situation where inspectors were sent out across the country. And within a couple of years, in part because of the passage of Medicare, 80% of these facilities were in compliance, but there were significant hospitals that were not. A leading one was in Alabama. It played games. It did what you might call Potemkin village compliance. So for example, in one situation, an inspector came to a hospital in Alabama, and the superintendent took the inspector into a room. He said, here, we integrate, here's a ward. And he opened the door, there were 4 beds, and there were 2 Black patients, 1 white patient, 1 Mexican patient, and they were all totally comatose. That's the sort of game playing that these facilities had. One of the most extreme versions of this was the hospital that Dr. Kausert was a staff member of, and she became an informant of the federal government, letting the regulators know what was really going on. The government sent a high official to tell the hospital it had to do right or its funds would be cut off. He may have communicated with her. All we know is that within a week, she was found dead on her front porch. So the local community labeled this as an accident and various other things. There was no FBI investigation, as far as I know. The situation was forgotten. And I moved on to my other cases and situations. I brought other healthcare discrimination cases. I became a legal law professor. And 3 or 4 years ago, I got a phone call from a medical legal historian who had investigated the Kausert situation. And he said to me, I think it was a murder. I think it was a homicide. Would you investigate? Well, fortunately, at Northeastern Law School, where I was the dean and I now teach, we had a cold case project run by a wonderful colleague of mine, Margaret Burnham. And with her students, we looked into the situation and we found that everybody was dead, that there were no files that had not disappeared, and there was no community knowledge sufficient to write the kind of advocacy report or reopen matters. All we could do was ask the Department of Justice to investigate, and nothing happened until 2 weeks ago. when the department opens an investigation. We don't know what the result will be. So that I had to call the doctor, the professor doctor up and tell him we were at a dead end. And I thought that was the matter, that was the end of the matter. And 2 weeks after that, I realized I could not let the story go. It was too evocative because of what it symbolized and what was deeply involved in it and how it related, most importantly, to what's going on today in the healthcare world. And I had written a novel many years ago for Random House, so I decided to fictionalize this. And so it is a novel, and it is enjoyable or not on the basis of the interesting story it tells. Some of it is as accurate as I could make it. Some of it, much of it, is like any novel. It's a product of the author's imagination. So that's why it's a novel.
Well, I would argue that what makes the novel carry are the characters that move it beyond a history into a different type of history, because I think what I appreciate about it is being able to look at these events through the eyes of people who were living it and who were injured in it or went on to do other things. For me, it's also interesting because I know you a bit, and as the author, I think it's a look into a different part of your career. And I wonder if you could talk just a little bit about why you went to the Deep South in the first place, because the main character, I think, in a lot of ways tracks with similar maybe motivations, but perhaps I'm wrong.
Well, I just want to emphasize that while there's a lot of law in this book, this is not a book aimed at lawyers or even law-focused people. This is a novel, and it either stands or falls on the basis of the yarn and the characters, as you point out. The main male character, the character who is in love with the doctor, is certainly his character involves information and aspects that come from my own life. That's the way fiction always is. But there's one big difference. He is someone who was a prosecutor. I've never been a prosecutor, and I never wanted to be. And the reason he goes south is because he's sick and tired of putting people in prison. He doesn't think they're all good people, but he doesn't see what the world is getting out of it. And he just doesn't think that's the way he should spend his life. Now, why does he decide, instead of going to work for Goldman Sachs, why does he decide to go south? Well, first of all, it's the 1960s, and there's an opportunity to do that and serve. And many lawyers of all sorts saw that as an opportunity to change their lives. But then there's a place where his experience is very similar to mine. His father was involved in one of those, as a lawyer, one of those incredible racial incidents in the post-war period where a Black serviceman on a bus was shot and killed. In my case, my parents took me to the South on vacations, and experiencing segregation of railroad cars and then public facilities as an impressionable young person marked me. I'll never forget getting off the train in Savannah, Georgia, when I must have been 10 years old, and innocently looking up at the sign, and my mother was holding my hand as we walked down the platform, and I must have said something like, "What does that mean, Mom? Colored waiting room, white waiting room." And there was a very well-dressed Southern man who was walking down the platform with us, And he turned and he gave her and me the most scornful, disgusted look. And I think experiences like that must have played into why I became a civil rights lawyer. There's more complicated than that. Of course, I grew up in a very liberal family, and I grew up in New York, and I think New York's diversity was very much part of my childhood. And so I ended up not wanting to do anything but work for the American Civil Liberties Union. And a mentor figure I went to after I graduated from law school, before I had a job, he said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "Oh, I want to work for the American Civil Liberties Union." And he said, "They already have a lawyer. A lawyer." That's the way things were then. But as I was leaving his office, he turned to me and said, "I think Thurgood Marshall's looking for somebody." Changed my life in a big way.
There's a lot in here about the relationship between the white attorney Christopher North and his law partner, who's from Gulf City, an African-American lawyer named Orzel Williams. There's a lot in there, I think, about what a white person and a lawyer might perceive when they arrive in this place, and the need and the experience of this Black lawyer to really try and give him the reality check. Can you talk a little bit about what inspired that character of Orzel Williams and what experiences that is rooted in?
Well, some of the greatest Americans I've known, and I've known a lot of them, were Black civil rights lawyers in the South. And the way the Legal Defense Fund operated was we connected with Black practitioners across the South in bringing cases. Sometimes they would initiate the case. Sometimes we would contact them and say, "How about this?" Sometimes the clients would come to them. Sometimes the clients would come to us. In the 50s and 60s, though, these were among the very few community people, these lawyers, who had status and some protection, but they were deeply involved in their communities under extraordinarily stressful conditions. They might be the lawyer in a big civil rights case that we brought. They also might be handling your divorce or your claim against a sharecropper's claim against his farmer owner. And they were under enormous stress, and they were fabulous. Some of them were just fabulous people. And I would say that while I learned a lot of law at the Yale Law School, I learned a lot of life from each one of these people. And so each one of them had great stories. Just one of my favorites was beaten up by sheriffs in southern Georgia because of the way he behaved and the way he talked. He was a master of the King's English, and the sheriff didn't like that. And years later, they named the post office after him. Total turnaround. Each one of these guys was fabulous. Now, you spent your years in New Orleans. There was nothing in New Orleans like the chief civil rights lawyer, A.P. Toureau. And he was the person to go to in the entire community. As I may have explained to you once when we had a drink, he and I integrated the first public facility, a restaurant in the New Orleans area. It was then at the airport. And we went out to the airport after we got the court order to celebrate. And we ordered a meal, and they served us. And I, was in my congratulatory, "Oh boy, look what I've done" mode. And I said to AP, "Well, look what we've done." He said, "It doesn't count a bit. I look too white." Each one of these guys had a great story. And so Orzel in the book is I don't like the word composite, but I drew upon these people in creating what he had to say to North.
So I think a lot about solidarity between white and black and other people who, especially in this moment that we're in now, which is a different sort of crisis, seem to have similar aims. In that experience, and I think, this is what I liked about the North Williams conversations. There's a lot there about why they get along, why they're able to work together. For you, what are some of the reasons why they were able to work together, or perhaps why you throughout your career have been able to build those kind of bridges? Because I do think there's a lot of learning we need to do in order to maybe rebuild some of those bridges, given the pressures we're under right now.
Well, I hope there is. I think the profession helped that, facilitated that in my case. We talked the same language most of the time because of our legal training and because of what we had to do. The place where I think the real connection was made, the emotional connection, which is what is required in a novel too, was not so much the law, although it was in the context. And you can see that in the novel. For example, I had never even seen a bottle of illegal still-made alcohol until I went south in 1961 or two. I was in a car that went to an illegal still where somebody bought some alcohol and offered me some white lightning. And that's just maybe a metaphor for a lot of experiences. I had never eaten soul food until I went south. And I'm not sure I will ever again. But these are the kinds of experiences that went along with working closely with these lawyers. At the time, they were almost all men. That's changed now. And there were very few of them. One has to remember that each one of these was a critical part of the community. There were at the time, there were only 3 civil rights lawyers in the entire state of Mississippi. And one of them was maybe not the lawyer you would want to hire. And that's true of across the board. There were very, very few of these people, and they were courageous.
As a question in the chat, can you please discuss how you came up with the title portion, who paid for the bullet? I think that's a very key question.
Yeah, well, that gets into the guts of the novel. First of all, Mosaic, because there are a lot of characters, and like a lot of tiles in a mosaic. And who paid for the bullet? Because that is the question. Is who ordered the killing, if it was a killing? And it wasn't necessarily the person who did the killing. And that brings us to the power structure of the community that's involved, which is called Gulf City. For reasons that novel readers might understand, I think. I don't name a big city in Alabama where there's a huge a bay. I call it Gulf City. That helped me write the book. It just made it feel better. But
picked up on it. I got it.
And so, yeah, I think that's it. I mean, and
no, I think you did, and I guess I also think about a whole structure that really paid for that bullet, not just the one character. And so,
well, that's the point. It's not just a novel about an errant crime; it's also a novel about potential revenge. And so who paid for the bullet is the search north encounters.
Mhm.
And what he does about it is the fulcrum on which the novel is based. And again, while I understand there's law in it, I did not write this book as a legal tome.
Sure. But I'm going to go back into the law, I think, for my next questions. We touched on, well, I'm going to ask a question from the chat from our good friend Rajni first. Did the two lawyers question the structure of the law itself, that it is not some objective body, rather that the law, writ large, always grows out of the group in power? Do the lawyers' characters interrogate the law itself?
Oh, she always asks the toughest.
I was going to say that. I was going to say.
Well, they are focused on the thing in front of them. They are focused on the nitty gritty, to use the term that comes out of the black argot. They're interested in changing people and changing practices and winning cases and dealing with people. And the philosophical or deeper questions are latent. And that to me, without getting pontifical, is what a good book does. It puts you in a situation which you understand, which grips you, but then it leaves you with larger questions. And if I'm totally successful, Rodney, you'll explore those deeper questions more readily because of the book. But the characters in this book, they imply such things, but that's not where they're going. They're going with the life in front of them.
But I hear you. I think that is where the book is really successful, is they stay on this very human kind of practical scale, even in their emotions. And it allows the reader to take away, I think, these bigger questions and this bigger disturbance in what we think of with the law, and how we think of who practices and who manipulates it. So in that, I encourage you all to read the book for that reason too. I think I had a related question, and you mentioned it earlier. Healthcare is such a critical issue, even now. But when we learn the civil rights movement, that is not always the thing that bubbles up. That is not always the thing that's in the public conception. Again, what I appreciate is you have a case that itself is very dramatic, but at the same time, it's very much the machinations of segregation, which in so many ways were just so material and just had to do with just jamming up the gears to let inequality persist. How, when we look at present day healthcare and its issues, what are the legacies you see existing today of a case like this one and of that era when it comes to healthcare?
Well, this is really what I hope the biggest takeaway is from the story. And it's multi-layered and complicated. First of all, it's interesting how hard it was to win this victory. It's also interesting that healthcare discrimination has always been like a third level. It's not had the attention that it deserved, obviously. That was true in the civil rights era, and I think it's true today. There's a lot of talk about disparity now, which is wonderful, but we haven't come close to solving the problem. There was the lawsuits and the administrative actions made a great difference, but they really exposed how much more had to be done. And even the most superficial search today of the statistics of healthcare disparities, from addiction to maternal health and the pandemic, and I could go on for a long time, tells you how much remains to be done. So one thing, litigation is important, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. The Supreme Court has made litigation in this area more difficult. There needs to be more of it. but there needs to be a more general, non-fragmented strategy to deal with disparities. And that I hope is part of the latent message of the book. It was so hard to accomplish what we accomplished then. And it was just the beginning. As I often say to, and shock people who generally know a lot more about life than I do, the American Medical Association did not admit Black doctors and physicians until 1968. Now, as my friend Randy Kennedy points out, we usually talk about reparations and reparative policies when we're talking about slavery. Oh, it's back then, 100, how are we going to find out who 1968? I was alive in 1968. I was, in fact, I was 31 years old. Now, think about a young Black person who was interested in medicine and who in the 1960s would like to be a doctor. And he or she finds out that the American Medical Association won't accept Black doctors. Now, that has consequences. That person is not a doctor. The statistics of minority physicians in this country are dramatically poor. When one thinks about reparations, it's not necessarily the horrors of slavery. It's something that happened in our lifetime. And I think that's something that you begin to be open to understand when the story or stories like this novel, it's not the only way, obviously, gets out there. And to tell you the truth, that's why I care so much about getting attention for the book, why I'm so grateful to you and others who have interviewed me or passed on wisdom about the book, because that, I think, is what you ultimately take away, a good story and some questions about why we're still dealing with this in the way we are.
And what America we would be living in had we not allowed that to persist for so long. If those people, if that individual could become a doctor or get fair medical treatment, there is a different path for this country, I think, that we haven't been on, because again and again, those routes have been limited on the individual and institutional level.
Well, one of the nice things about the grant applications we look at every year at Mass Humanities is there are a lot of people who are trying to putting their oar in the water to try and work on such issues. Agreed.
Something you and I said if we would try and save time for was the late Bill Russell. Very relevant to this conversation. But I wanted to, ask you just to comment on his passing and on who he was.
Well, all sports fans can turn off now. I had two associations to Bill Russell. The first is that I grew up in Manhattan, and when I was a kid, there was a program called the GO program, which allowed high school students in New York City high schools, and I went to one of them, Stuyvesant, to go to Madison Square Garden, paying absolutely nothing, really, like $2 or $1, to sit and watch basketball games and hockey games. And this was the NBA before it became the true NBA. But what I learned in those years of being if you look up here, you see a picture of me on the basketball court. I was a basketball player. And so I was doubly interested in basketball. And I was a Knickerbocker fan. And what happened to the Knickerbockers? No matter what, they lost to the Celtics. There was always a jump shot from JoJo White or someone or Cousy or Sharman or Russell or somebody, Heinzen, that sunk the Knicks. And it was just part of life that the Knickerbockers could win a lot of games, but when it came down to the crunch, Red Auerbach and the Celtics and Bill Russell would win. So in 1979, I became the dean of the Northeastern Law School, and my family moved up here. Friends said to me, "How can you go to Boston? You don't have a passport." They thought of me so much as so much of a New Yorker. So I started going to Celtic games on and off at the old Garden. And one day it occurred to me that I could root for the Celtics. I was no longer a New Yorker. I was living up here, and they were my team, and I could actually be on the right side of those games.
Which is just luckily right as Larry Bird gets drafted. You make
Exactly.
That's really miraculous.
And so I sort of just rolled on the wave of all those victories. So that's one of the two stories. The other story is, in a way, more poignant. I was fortunate to represent Muhammad Ali in the case that brought him back to boxing. For people who don't know about it, basically, when he refused induction in the armed services, he was banned from boxing. They took away his crown. And for 2 years, he couldn't work. He was reviled. The number of editorials, the number of death threats, astronomical, remarkable in the fact that 25 years later, he's the most popular person in the world. But that's the way it was in the 1960s. And eventually we brought a case that showed that he was the only person New York State had ever banned for being involved with the criminal law. They, in fact, like as boxers, all sorts of felons, people convicted of murder, manslaughter, burglary, all sorts of harms, assault, but which exposed what was really going on. Well, during those years when he was reviled, Bill Russell's support of Muhammad was extraordinarily important. And we all knew that. And it was that kind of support that ultimately allowed everything to sort out and change. So Bill Russell.
Financial support? Was it financial support as well as
spiritual? No.
Yeah.
No, I need to emphasize how even in a variety of minority communities, Ali's unwillingness to serve in the war. Remember, this is a period where we're all anti-communists is the great horror, and somehow or other, until Vietnam was exposed for what it was, he was treated as if he was a traitor. And Russell came to his support. Other people did. I'm not suggesting that that was the essential element, but it was very important to Muhammad, I believe.
Huh. I think my last question, I got another one from our good friend. Could you talk about your play on the Guantanamo detainees and why you wrote it? And I will couple that with what are you going to write next?
Oh, well, it's a great play, and I wrote it because it was happening in our name, the torture in Guantanamo, and that's the name of the play. But it's terribly frustrating because I believe in bread on the waters. If the world likes what I've done, it'll support it. If it doesn't, it won't. I just do my thing. But this play, I believe, never had a chance. It was performed 3 or 4 times in Boston and once in New York, I think, successfully, but it never was able to pick up a New York audience. And I believe that the real reason was not the quality of the play, although obviously I'm self-interested, but the fact that people did not really want to confront what was going on. And in fact, our legal system has avoided true confrontation, and our society has avoided true confrontation. Well, I don't know whether that's true, but it's what I believe. Maybe I'm just trying to explain why my play didn't go any further. What am I going to write next? The world will tell me. I'm enjoying talking about this book. I retire from teaching next year, and I'll see what comes my way.
There's a quote in the book about the profession. Just like a doctor can be concerned with your bowels or your feet or your ear, nose, or throat, or how those large cell tumors in your lungs are going to kill you, just so a lawyer can be a hustler or a princely do-gooder or a total corporate robot, or the guy who puts you in or keeps you safe from too many years in a cell. It feels to me like you have done much of the doing good in those roles. And I wonder, given that you're retiring in a year, if that's still the advice you impart to people entering the profession, or if there's a more updated version of that guidance that you give people to encourage them to make this choice, which is, serves so many of us well with lawyers like yourself.
That's a very profound question. I grew up, maybe it's very American, but I grew up believing in autonomy. And I've changed a lot over the years. But when it comes to students, I never tell them what to do. My role is to facilitate whatever comes out of them. And fortunately, I've taught wonderful young people over the years. And even the last seminar I taught in the spring, I think the students were as good as I've ever encountered, which is nice to be able to conclude, because so many people are down on what's happening in universities these days. But no, I don't. I don't should people, and I'm just rewarded by those who make choices that I think are socially valuable. And the institutions I've worked in support that, by and large.
Thanks, Michael. It's been really, really good to talk to you. It's been great to read you, and I hope to see you in person quite soon.
Are there any questions from anybody else? Or are we done that?
I've been dropping in some good ones, and a lot of thanks here for you as well. Anybody have any others before we head out? Great. Again, the book is Mosaic, Who Paid for the Bullet? Michael emphasized to me that you should try and get it at your local bookstore. You can find it on barnesandnoble.com and other online venues as well. But I really do hope you check out this book for all the reasons we talked about here today.
Thanks so much, Brian, and everybody for your questions.
Thanks, Michael. Bye. Bye, Brian. See you.
Thanks, everyone.